The Buggy's visual design is a prime example of all citizen-built tech in Half-Life 2. Its cobbled together and war-torn design shows two things: that the Combine occupation has been long enough to preclude the acquisition of new parts, and that the rebel citizens are resilient, creative, and resourceful, making do with what they can find. Using an object's visual design to add detail to the game's history is an unobtrusive way of adding depth to the fiction.
Often, the more work one puts into inserting small, natural details, the more likely it is that these efforts will go unnoticed. This is an ironic truth about production, and is related to the concept of decreasing returns. One example are the seagulls during the highway chapters. Most players spot them flying around, but few have noticed that they will perch and defecate on the buggy while the player is exploring a structure along the coast, only to fly away upon the player's return. While these details often go by happily unnoticed, they do flesh out the world of Half-Life 2 and leave a small thing for players to discover the next time they play.
In Half-Life 1, Valve wanted to give the players freedom in creating their own identity, which is why the player was able to kill friendly NPCs along with their enemies. Originally, the player could do this in Half-Life 2 as well. However, this led to several problems. First of all, it limited the kind of storytelling Valve could accomplish. Secondly, Half-Life 2's more realistic look made the characters more sympathetic, and made killing them less fun. This also created a problem on the coast levels. In order to coax the player out of the buggy, an NPC would run into the road and grab the player's attention, only to be accidentally run over.
When creating a realistic game, it is important that elements within the game's world appear as they do in the real world. Achieving a realistic look is often accomplished through the use of reference photos taken by the developers from various locations. When creating the coast for Half-Life 2, Valve took photos from aircraft carriers, shipbuilding yards, and Arctic research vessels. When creating a reference for the magnetic crane, Valve employee Laura DeBuc went to West Seattle to get photos for the crane's exterior, and used the cockpit of a bulldozer as the reference for the crane's interior.
The Combine gunship's unique gameplay actually came about from a mistake. The gunship was to aim at the player while the player fired rockets at the gunship. However, the gunship's AI decided that the rockets fired upon it were a more immediate threat, and targeted those more often than the player. This playtested so well that the gunship battles were reimagined into what they are today, a game of cat and mouse, with rockets.
When undertaking a project as large as Half-Life 2, it's impossible to work on the entire game at once, and it's important to break it down into several smaller problems. Valve decided to tackle this by dividing the Half-Life 2 development team into smaller groups called Cabals. Each Cabal would consist of several people with differing talents: animators, level designers, and programmers. There were 4 Cabals during Half-Life 2's development, 3 of which would work on the gameplay, and would each tackle a different section of the game, such as the coast, the prison, canals, etc. The 4th would work on the cinematic scenes, working alongside the gameplay Cabals to tell the story of Half-Life 2.
Here's a bit of car-related trivia. The sound for the Buggy was created from a sound library and is a recording of a 1968 Camaro with a racing engine and stainless steel exhaust pipes.
In many ways, the Half-Life games are about the illusion of freedom. For example, scripted sequences replace cutscenes, but they don't actually allow the player to have any input, just as many seemingly open scenarios only have one true solution. Overall, the Half-Life games are linear, despite almost always giving the player complete control over Gordon. In order to allow players to believe they are in control and preserve this illusion, each map is filled with optional content. By adding in many side areas that the player may ignore or stumble upon, the world becomes more rich, immersive, and believable. This can be difficult, but the payoff is worth it. This kind of design is increasingly common in AAA action games, but Valve likes to have some fun with it, and the constant motif of trains can be seen as a subtle nod to how the player is going to spend the duration of the game on a predetermined path, whether they know it or not.
Throughout the development of Half-Life 2, the wilderness outside of City 17 changed many times, more so than any other concept. It was, at one time, conceived as a dried seafloor with the last drops of the ocean being drained by a teleport, and at another, it was a vast scrapyard of junked military vehicles. The one theme that stuck from the wasteland's inception to its eventual evolution into the coast, however, is the presence of the City 17 Railroad. It connects the various locations and makes them cohesive, while helping to reassure the player that they are headed in the proper direction.
One of the dilemmas when trying to create a realistic game is balancing realism with gameplay. A level with finely tuned gameplay may be disrupted during an art pass, and a level that looks realistic and believable may be sullied by a gameplay pass. The best levels, according to Valve employee David Sawyer, are levels where art passes support the gameplay and inspire it. A prime example is this bridge sequence. The art here matches the gameplay, and the gameplay here matches the art, creating a memorable and cohesive experience.